former Minnesota Vikings head coach Mike Zimmer unloads on his former NFL employer that once called him the head coach for the Minnesota Vikings. We are going to lay it all out on this episode, and there's going to be a fun discussion and reaction about Mike Zimmer, his comments, and much, much more. So let's dive into it. Mike Zimmer coached the Minnesota Vikings for a while back in the day, and he unloaded on an interview with Star Tribune writer Mark Craig. And let's just read some of the comments. I'll share the screen with you so you can follow along with me, because there are a lot of comments that made headlines on Saturday from this past weekend. This article came from MinnesotaSportsFan.com, which I am on daily, a great website. He had this to say about Chris Boyd. He said, some of the negative player reactions after his firing hardly registered for Zimmer. Chris Boyd? He says something about me? He says, I'm like, dude, you had more special team penalties than anyone I can remember. And when he was the head coach for the Minnesota Vikings, him and Minnesota Vikings play-by-play broadcaster, KFAN personality, Paul Allen, who's been on this show multiple times, very good guy, very nice guy, a fellow Christian, which is absolutely awesome. They used to be friends. And Mike Zimmer ended that relationship pretty quickly because Paul Allen reported a snafu between Mike Zimmer and Kirk Cousins back when the fight was happening on the sidelines after the Minnesota Vikings kicked like the game-winning field goal after they were down a lot of points. Kirk Cousins got in Mike Zimmer's face. Mike Zimmer got in Kirk Cousins' face, and there's a little pushing match. And I think the first reaction to this little pushing match was just intensity, excitement, overjoyment, and just two guys that didn't know how to react because they were so excited. But then as the story came out, it wasn't that at all. It was literally two players that hated each other, well, a head coach and a player that hated each other, and they were literally in each other's faces because they did not like each other. But so Paul Allen reported about that. He said, and here's what Zimmer said. He says, hey, I pushed Kirk back pretty hard too, Zimmer says for the record, but I just didn't like what PA said. We are supposed to be friends. Why you got to talk about me? Unfortunately, I hold grudges. That's just how I am. So this is Mike Zimmer. And apparently he bought Paul Allen out of the horse that they had together at Canterbury Park, I think it was. And then the juicy nugget came out about the draft where they drafted Kellen Mond and a couple of other guys. So I'll just read it. It says, the first round, Rick tried to trade up for Justin Fields, who hasn't done anything, Zimmer says. With 4 third-round picks, Spielman selected in order. Quarterback, Kellen Mond. Linebacker, Chaz Surratt. Offensive lineman, Wyatt Davis. And defensive end, Patrick Jones II. Zimmer was there for only the first pick. When he picked Mond, I walked out of the room, Zimmer says. I left the building. I didn't even talk to him on the phone. The two spoke the next morning. Rick said, you mad at me? I said, yeah. I think you took 4 backups when we had guys there I thought were starters, Zimmer says. From that time on, it just kind of got worse between us. And the relationship between Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer is very well reported. Zimmer couldn't stand Spielman. He hated him from the moment that he signed Kirk Cousins to a 3-year deal worth a lot of money. And Mike Zimmer wanted to focus his problems or focus all of his energy on the defensive side of the ball because he's a defensive head coach. And they had the success back when Case Keenum threw the miracle. But my problem with the miracle play, and it's a sensational play, but you cannot base future seasons for the Minnesota Vikings on that miracle play. You cannot say, well, we made it to the NFC Championship game with Case Keenum. They did, but it took a miracle to get there. And the odds that you're going to get another miracle to land in the NFC Championship game from Case Keenum, who's been a subpar average quarterback his entire career, isn't going to be likely again. And I think that's the stance that Rick Spielman took. I mean, it makes sense. You are not going to recreate a special season from Case Keenum like he did with the Minnesota Vikings when he threw the miracle to Stephon Diggs. You're not going to do that again, no matter how great your defense is. And the Denver Broncos tried to recreate that with Case Keenum, gave him the big contract, and he failed there. Wasn't very successful. So Mike Zimmer's upset at Rick Spielman for bringing in Kirk Cousins after they had a very good season with their defense and with Case Keenum and blah, 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 blah. But you weren't going to recreate that with Case Keenum. You needed some magic superstar talent in the building. And that's what Kirk Cousins sort of offers. He's not a superstar talent, but he's certainly an all-pro, all-star talent, a quarterback that the Minnesota Vikings hadn't had since 2009 with Brett Favre. He at least put the Minnesota Vikings in the game, gave him a chance. But Mike Zimmer hated Kirk Cousins from the get-go, and he hated Rick Spielman from the get-go. He hated Kellen Mond and Wyatt Davis and Chasser Tom. What was his name? I don't know. Who knows? He was a bust. Chaz Surratt, hated that guy too. So my overall reaction from Mike Zimmer in this article is, wow, how can a guy be so hard-nosed? He's a hard-nosed head coach. He's honest players. Apparently he didn't say hello to the players as they walked down the hallway. I think Brian O'Neill talked about that. And at the same time, be so sensitive. You're so hard on your defensive and offensive players. You're a hard-nosed head coach, but PA reports on a little snafu between you and Kirk Cousins, and you end the relationship? Rick Spielman drafts a couple of guys they didn't want, which I'm sure happens all the time between general manager and head coach, and you can't even stay in the building? You are soft with a capital S. You are weak. You know, as this article comes out and you're reading, you know, the quotes from it, because I don't have a subscription at the Star Tribune. You read some of these things and you lose respect for Mike Zimmer. I mean, this makes him look worse than he already did. There was already so many players that came out after his firing and said, Zimmer did this and Zimmer did that. This was not good. He was not a good head coach. He was terrible to his players and to his staff and blah, 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 whatever. And then he comes out and makes himself look even worse in this article, talking about holding grudges and ending relationships because of a report. Talking about not even answering the phone or being in the building when the Minnesota Vikings called their draftees. It's like you're not even giving your players a chance to be successful. You're not putting them in a situation or a structure to be successful. You're building your own bridge. Building your own bridge? Whoops, wrong button.
Huh?
You're building your own grave. So what are you doing, man? I thought John Creasel, who is a K-fan personality, worded it really well. And I'm going to read it. I'm going to share this screen with you on Twitter. Says, I used to think Mike Zimmer was a solid coach, and I loved his rugged approach, which I think a lot of people agree with. The no-nonsense stuff, that's enjoyable for a time. You know, it's fun to see a head coach not take any crap from anybody. And then he continues, but that Strib article is an indictment. He expected toughness out of his players while simple criticism hurt him. Charmin soft. This article makes Mike Zimmer look like a soft piece of shit. He looks terrible in this article. And any future head coaching jobs are probably out the window. And maybe he doesn't want one. Maybe he just wants to be the defensive coordinator for the Cowboys for the rest of his career. But wow. I don't think I've ever seen a more stupid decision from a former head coach to go to a national or local entity. My thumbs up was up, so it gave me a thumbs up. And make himself look like a complete jackass. Because that's how he looks. What a story. Great job by Mark Craig of the Star Tribune to get this story out there. Stupid decision by Mike Zimmer to let it out there. Because anything that was going to make him look good from this article. And then he talked about his son and losing him, I think it was to alcoholism. Talked about that process, which, of course, no one's going to write about that. No one's going to talk about the reaction to Mike Zimmer, because I didn't see any of it. It was all about how he treated his former players and former draft picks. That's the juicy stuff. The sentimental stuff, I'm sure, was really good. I didn't get a chance to read it because I don't have a subscription, and nobody talked about it. Nobody reacted to it. So, anyways, those are my reactions to Mike Zimmer's tell-all with the Minnesota Vikings.